It's great to see so many faces this afternoon. It's good to see you all again. I'm going to go ahead and start us out. We're really excited about today's content. You are actually at part 4 of the 6-part Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies webinar series, and we are moving our focus to governance strategies and the interplay between fiscal strategies and governance, which I'm sure many of you are well versed in the fact that these two things are pretty inextricably linked in how we make change for how our system functions for young children and families. My name is Gina Capito, and I'm one of the principals of the Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies project. Just as a reminder, here's where we are on March 3rd. We're going to move into governance and shared leadership. We have built off in this series, starting with the comprehensive frame for approaching fiscal strategies. And then we moved into sort of some of the pieces of how you actually address the idea of having answers to questions. So mapping of the funding sources, modeling and understanding the cost of services, the cost of the system, understanding some revenue generation strategies, as well as innovative strategies to implement programming to sort of maximize and sorry, I was just muted there for a second by the host. And so what we're doing is we're layering this content, really then moving into thinking about how the information that you gather through those different fiscal strategies and some of the changes that you may be determining that you need to make, then play together with things like governance and shared leadership. Across all of these, and really starting with today and then moving through the rest of the webinars, we're also going to be moving much more intentionally into thinking about equity as well. We've talked from the very beginning about the fact that fundamentally how we finance things and how some of the broken ways that we finance things has direct implications to the equity issues that we see, and that we can't be housing or populating equity tables that are separate from fiscal strategies tables. But I think you're going to hear that even more so today than at other webinars and then going forward in the series. And so to move us with no further ado to what we're going to cover this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in the country, we are going to be talking a little bit about that idea of the comprehensive fiscal analysis approach to informing systems change. And then we are joined by a featured speaker from Los Angeles County, who is going to move us into really thinking about the idea of local governance as a change maker. We're going to then also talk about the idea of redesigning our state governance systems and some of the implications of that. And then we'll talk next steps. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Simon Workman to launch us into the content.
Thanks, Gina, and hi everyone. Good to see lots of familiar faces and names on the virtual Zoom screen again. As Gina said, today we're really going to dig into this idea of governance and equity. And so just kind of getting started on this, we do want to put it into that context and that frame, as we always do, of talking about this in a comprehensive way. So, you know, if you'll remember our graphic that we've shown you at the beginning of all the webinars in this series, on the next slide, we have our kind of theory and our understanding of the comprehensive the comprehensive approach is this melding of the fiscal and equity and governance analysis as a necessary component to get that comprehensive fiscal approach, which we're really going to dig into today with the great example from LA County, to get to achieving your vision. And so we really have spent the last couple of webinars focused on that fiscal cog. We talked a lot about fiscal mapping and analysis, revenue and expense modeling, and revenue generation strategies in the last, episode in the last webinar in our series. And now on the next slide, you see we're digging into really just focusing on the equity and the governance components of this, which really are, completely interrelated. And so this really gets to, yes, you think about your fiscal analysis, what are the equity implications of it? What are the governance implications of it? What is the governance analysis you need to do? And as we think about that, what do we mean by a governance analysis? Well, that's answering questions like, who's managing the funding streams that you identified in your fiscal map? If you remember when we talked about fiscal mapping, we talked about the need to do that comprehensive analysis of it and really understanding all the details, not just the dollar amount that's related to a particular revenue stream. So this is when you start to say, okay, who is governing all of those different funding streams? How are those governing entities working together? Is there a shared leadership structure for them? Is there a shared understanding of the vision and the principles that is underlying all of that, all of those funding streams? And who does that governance structure favor? Is it easier for certain communities or certain parts of the P5 system to drive their agenda compared to others, given the way we have that governance structure set up? And of course, that has huge equity implications when you start thinking about how are the structures we have in place at the moment within this system favoring certain communities, certain parts of the system over others. And the same as you start thinking about revenue generation strategies, there's a clear governance and equity tie with that. If we think about who is managing that new revenue stream, and we talked about that in the last session about the considerations of where the funding should go and who should be responsible for it and who even gets access to it. And so as we think about today, we're going to be thinking about governance and equity, but very much with that fiscal lens to it as well, and seeing how it all comes together, and how a fiscal analysis can't really be done in a bubble. You need to really take that more comprehensive approach to it as well. And so, as always, we like to start off with our principles. Those of you who've joined us for the whole webinar series will very much remember these and have seen them a number of times. Particularly today, I wanted to highlight the third and the fourth principle here in bold. As we're thinking about the impacts of your current system and any changes you need to make to the system, again, holding these principles at the forefront of your mind is really key, especially as the work gets really hard, which it really does in the governance space, when we're starting talking about breaking down the silos of current and long-established governance structures. You often face a lot of resistance. Any change to the status quo can get into a lot of resistance. So having those shared agreements on the principles can really help you kind of break through that resistance and really talk back to an agreement on these principles and why it's necessary to make the changes you need in order to move forward on these principles. When you're talking about in societal inequities that have been around for a long time, changing those and remediating those is going to be hard. But if you have a shared agreement to do that, that helps you move forward with some of the necessary changes you need to make to the status quo. So with that grounding in our shared vision and frame and principles, I'm going to pass it back to Gina now, who's going to talk about the functioning of the system that these principles will help you to support.
Thanks. So when we talk about the principles, we start, and you saw that there on that previous slide, it's a system that. So fundamentally, what we're really talking about is the system at play. As we move from just answering questions or thinking about fiscal strategies, but then thinking about change and how do you move change, and talking now about governance and other components, it really seemed appropriate to begin introducing and not just talking about systems change, but thinking a little bit about some of those concepts of a strong functioning system and building a strong system. So we want to introduce this concept as we are focusing on, and you see that governance administration and the financing strategies and funding mechanisms are a little bit darker purple than the other one. So just because that's where a lot of our energy has gone in this series, as well as sort of through this type of work, but we wanted to frame it in the interplay of these. These are the core components of any strong functioning system, whether it's for your childcare sector alone, or whether it's really thinking about your whole prenatal to 5 space. These are the components that you have in place, or the components that you're working on having in place, and they really do interplay together. Clearly, governance and administration and the fiscal strategies and how we finance or administer the funding are sort of undergird what professional development looks like, how supports for continuous quality improvement in the implementation of services plays out, right? Like get that interplay among the things. And so that's one of the reasons why those two circles in particular, and how we really think about the work within prenatal to 5 fiscal strategies, that these two are such drivers to how the system functions as well, and are often, as Simon said, the places that are going to need the most systems change. So we really think about governance and administration, or as many places are moving towards more referring to it as shared leadership, as part of a well-functioning system. We really have to be then thinking about how does that governance and how does that shared leadership meet the needs of the system? And are there places where it could be the key to driving the change that will improve how we finance things, how we use our resources, how we draw in more revenue, and do so once we draw that new revenue in, do so in a way that is going to be efficient and meet families' needs. That there are going to be times where, and I think many of you have probably ran into some of these instances where some of the governance is the barrier to those steps forward. And so that's why we are so eager to really be thinking about these things in the play together versus thinking about them in a siloed way. And so really being clear in how is your governance currently designed to support you in moving on those principles that we talk about, and kind of really think about how you're embedding and moving them forward. And one of the things as states and communities, one of your first steps is really to think about how are you working on governance currently, if you are. And so doing a little bit of an assessment of readiness or assessment of how you're engaging around this issue is one of the first things that we want to share to support you in having some kind of next steps thinking of where you may take this. So one of the first things to really understand where your own work is on governance as part of your prenatal to 5 fiscal strategies work, whether or not it has been a piece of it. And when you think about fiscal strategies, have you also thought about the complementary governance that's in place within your state or community? And whether or not, like, moving towards more of a shared leadership approach than maybe more of the traditional governance, has that also been part of what your fiscal table has been thinking about and working on, and has it been engaging with those sectors? And so, and who's leading it? Who's involved in the work? Like, where is it stemming from? All of those pieces are part of this idea of really beginning to reflect on your individual readiness as a state or community and really unpack some of the components of it, because it's going to come up, but how you approach it and that intentionality is going to be one of the most critical pieces of it. So really just thinking about, when you think about both the questions there that are on the slide, that's additional idea of, have you aligned at all with governance entities in your state or community? What does that alignment look like? That moving beyond sort of a, there needs to be change in governance, to more of thinking about how you each have roles in this space. How are you partnering? How are you individually and then collectively understanding the needs and the problems that you're trying to solve? And how can you be partnering to do that together? Sort of is the place that we want to begin thinking about how the systems change will occur, is functioning from more of that partnership place. And so to support us with that today, as we mentioned, that Los Angeles County was invited to join us, we really felt like this was an opportunity to unpack the idea of governance's role in fiscal strategies and really hear from governance and bring governance to the table in a much more direct way that has had experience with thinking about knowledge of fiscal strategies, knowledge of fiscal analysis, and tied those things together. So our featured speaker today that we've asked to join us is Maral Karaccusian, and Maral is with LA County Supervisor Janice Hahn's office. She is one of the policy deputies at Janice Hahn's office. And we wanted to kind of frame the why we invited Maral to join us this afternoon. And it had a lot to do with, one, the scale of Los Angeles County, and Maral's going to talk to you about that, on the sheer scale of it, if you're sort of not aware. But it's local and state together. And so there's a real opportunity to think about the interplay of those things. But they're also a community who has engaged in fiscal analysis of their early care and education in order to have more answers to questions and to really understand sort of where they're headed, and then also tied that with their governance. So they really have an opportunity to kind of speak about their example and their work, which is fully in progress. I think Maral would be one of the first to say that not that they have all the answers, but more so they are actively working on the problems and the issues, and it's a great opportunity to learn from. So before I turn it over to Maral, just wanted to highlight back to the components of a comprehensive fiscal analysis, because I think seeing these laid out together and then hearing about LA's work will really support you in kind of thinking about how that has supported their governance work and how governance's perspective on this, what that exactly looks like. And so we really highlight as part of this, that middle section of the analysis, that there's some element of understanding funding, where it's coming from, what are expenses, really understanding what's going on in communities around how programming is delivered, and pulling that all together with stakeholders to then build a set of recommendations that can then form an action plan for a community to move forward. And that is the type of process that Los Angeles County engaged in, focused on their early care and education system. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Maral to talk a little bit more about that work.
Thank you, Gina and Simon and Casey. It's really great to be here today and you know, to talk about governance. I always feel like I'm not part of the government, but because I really rely on my relationships with community, but I do know that my email address ends in a .gov, so I am part of the government. So it's really exciting to connect with you all. Make sure. Am I bouncing back right now? Okay. Okay, sorry. So it's part of the reason why and the rationale why we wanted to do a county-wide comprehensive fiscal analysis. And this really stemmed from amazing thought partners and it was a really great context of why we wanted to do this. We just wanted to get a landscape of where all the funding streams were. And so, you know, with the partnership of First 5 LA, the support of our Quality and Productivity Commission, the connection to the Office of Child Protection and their countywide prevention plan, we always heard about Gina and we heard about her work in San Francisco, and we're like, ooh, how do we do that here? And there were other leaders, obviously, that brought this to us. And so we wanted to just get an inventory. And I think I just wanted to kind of talk about how complex our systems are within LA County and the state of California. LA County is as big as any state. We're 10 million people. We have 88 cities. And in those 88 cities, 9 of our 10 million people are there. And then the county is responsible for the unincorporated areas. So, you know, that kind of covers all of us. But then we also have almost 80 school districts. So when you think about the complexities of what our funding streams look like, it's a maze, and it's entangled and enmeshed with each other. And so it was really important to kind of get a landscape to do this work so it can inform our policy decisions. And I think part of the perspective and what we wanted to really focus in on is, you know, what funding currently supports ECE services throughout LA County, because there wasn't a clear answer to that. We did piecemeal approaches. How are these funds used and are they being fully spent? I think that's the full utilization is such a key component to this work because of the inequity that exists and the lack of access. What opportunities existed to better coordinate, streamline, and maximize our existing funds, and how do we weave it all together? And what opportunities are there to draw down additional funding and or advocate for new funding as we identified the needs? So it was a wonderful process, and I have to acknowledge that we have a really tight community within LA County of leaders who have elevated this issue and who have been champions for our 0 to 5 population. And so it was really great to get plugged in and hear their perspective. You know, I mean, I could list all of them right now, but we had Gina and Simon and the team came down and met with some of our cities, the city of LA, the city of Long Beach, met with our community leaders, engaged with First 5 LA and the Best Start communities. And we just were able to get it's a comprehensive through and through and to identify the need. So, you know, it was really important for us to level the playing field and see how this work can inform policy change. And so what we ended up doing is talking to the community and engaging with some of our thought leaders. We thought, let's do a motion. So the Board of Supervisors governs through motions. So the Board of Supervisors, it's 5 Board of Supervisors, and we, again, oversee the entire county and all of the safety net services. So we govern through motion through our board meetings, which is board meetings on Tuesdays. And during the pandemic, it's been every other Tuesday. And so what we do is our legislation is our motions. So we did in October of 2020, we did a motion to kind of weave this all in together to elevate the issue and to raise awareness that we wanted to have a comprehensive fiscal analysis. And Gina, I think you worked on it for almost a year, over a year. I can't remember. Yeah. I mean, and you think about it. Yeah, it's a big county. It's a lot of trips out here, and it was over 4,000 square. We were over 4,000 square miles, but it really did give us a clear understanding of how complicated it is. And, you know, what I really appreciated and what I really adore about this process, and I have to say that, and we wanted to model ourselves after San Francisco because there's just so much synergy in San Francisco, but putting us in context of 88 cities and 80 school districts and 10 million people, it's a little harder to do. But it was really important for us to kind of see all of this and to really understand where some of our deficits were. And what I really appreciate about the fiscal analysis is that it not only identified our, what we set out to identify, it also came up with real concrete recommendations. And that for me is always something tangible, because once you get into the system, it's easy to identify. It's hard to identify it's easy to identify what the problems are, but it's really harder to identify what the solutions are. And so I think with this fiscal analysis, it gave us tangible next steps. And then, we were in the middle of figuring out what those next steps are, being informed and educated and really having a good understanding. And then the pandemic happened. And so I think this is we're all kind of reeling from it, but I could safely say that, it's such a strong network and so many leaders within this orbit that within LA County that we really were able to bounce back and have that approach to really serve our communities during the pandemic. And I think coming out of it, we can really take these recommendations and start implementing and looking at short-term goals, what's attainable right now, what lessons did we learn from the pandemic, and really partner with the state, because local government can only go so far. And yes, LA County is about a $36 billion entity, and it's always hard for me to say like, oh, we don't have the money or the resources when you think about it in that context. But so much of and what we identified in this fiscal analysis is tied into state. And so how does the state and the local communities work together to really, really work toward that equitable landscape? And I think for me, the ultimate dream here is, if a family comes into and needs services, they don't get turned away. The provider doesn't think about, oh man, I need to go fundraise this amount of money because my government dollars will only cover this much. So, how do we get to that point in time where we want to serve everyone and, just continue to provide. And I have to say with this fiscal analysis, again, there's 5 of us, and my colleagues and I use this as a playbook to figure out what those next steps are. And it really helps us know, in being part of this process, was knowing that we did engage with community and it wasn't done in a silo. And it was a real collaborative effort. So as the Board of Supervisors, and as we kind of get into this recovery period and what we want to do and how we partner together and the major pieces that are moving in the state, and now that we have a governor that's supportive of 0 to 5, more supportive of the 0 to 5, population, it's going to be great for us to take this information and help translate it into tangible change. And to reform the systems and to actually redo some of these things. And we really have to, it's the political buy-in, and I think when you think about governance and think about those structures, it's important for us to be informed as policy deputies and policy folk, to be engaged in the process, to contribute to the process, to maybe help you navigate the politics of it. But also when you're engaged with folks who do the governance piece of it, it's always good to have that, what's attainable right now. Just don't present the problem, present the solutions. And that's what I really appreciated about this fiscal analysis and this process. And then it's also just being strategic. It's being able to engage with and talk to folks who you have maybe oversight over, or you can kind of engage with in a what I like to call sister talks. Let's talk about the issue area. How do we serve our children and families better? It's not about you or me, but it's about getting the work done. And what can we do while we're here? And it really does take the leadership. And, I'm always thankful for my boss, giving me the green light to be able to run with this and really work with our department. So, it's just being able to navigate the inside while feeling the pressure from the outside. Again, like I said, I don't feel like I'm a .gov, but, at the end of the day, I do work within the government, and within this structure of the county, we're pretty empowered to engage with and ask questions and to inquire and to be solution focused and to work with our CEO's office for budget pieces and to work with the department to make sure we have, a wonderful opportunity to like get things done. And for us, it's been really wonderful. Yeah, I think the timing of doing this fiscal analysis was aligned with having an executive director of the Office of Advancement for Early Care Education, which is in our Department of Public Health here locally. So, you know, if you don't have that leadership within the county really focused on this and being able to be the hub, I don't think we have success either, regardless of all the leadership structure that exists. We also need to have that inside person whose sole purpose is to, you know, do all the things that we need to do to increase capacity, to have access, and to really look at this from an equitable lens. I mean, and then I think that's, and is there anything else, Gina, that I'm, it's so funny. Yeah,
well, I know we hear a lot from providers, and I think you're speaking a little bit to this, Maral, and it's a sort of a question that keeps coming up is, and I know you reference hearing from providers that they need the contracting process simplified, and there's too many strings related to funding streams. Can you speak a little bit about how, from a governance perspective, you would address or handle those things, or what you're trying to do to work on that issue? Because that's an issue that is universal across prenatal to 5 funding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to streamline and to simplify, right? I don't know why it feels sometimes as I take a deeper dive into different policy areas that we've built on a faulty foundation. It really does feel like it's one person who made a decision here or who interpreted something. And something for us here in local government is money that comes from the feds goes to the state, comes to us, and at every level it's interpreted, and they reiterate what their perspective is on it. And by the time it gets to local government, we add our, we have our county council, we have our CEO, we have our auditor controller, and then it just adds more complexities to it. So, the question becomes, how do you simplify and how do you streamline? And part of it is, in my ideal world, from every issue area that I focus on, from early care education to domestic violence, it's always like, how do we just kind of give you the money without any strings attached, and so for you to do the work? But unfortunately, contracting with the government, I would imagine, is a pretty universal difficulty. And for a county as huge as ours, with 36 county agencies, it's something we're unpacking and uncovering, as well as a board of supervisors. And that I think is a long-term, we're talking 3 to 5 year strategy here to fix. There is hope for us, though, in the ECE orbit with the state. And because we have First 5 LA, First 5 California, because we've had a Blue Ribbon Commission that led to the Master Plan on Aging, we're going to see what it looks like to have our ECE part of our funding streams go into a California Department of Social Services. So it's at least just there, and the California Department of Education, so I think there's a lot of moving pieces where I think we hear that we want things to be streamlined. And the skeptic in me is like, okay, it's going to take us 3 to 5 years to really simplify this process. I've always felt that private dollars can help us pilot and do demonstration projects that can help us get things done more quickly. What we do in the county is some of our initiatives, we park money in a third-party administrator and negotiate with them, and that way we can get the money out the door more quickly and to smaller mom and pops. We under Supervisor Hahn's leadership focused on a mental health incubation academy, and we have 29 nonprofits who've never contracted with the county before, and it's been a 1.5 or 2 year process to get them incubated and launched, and to figure out what that funding stream looks like. But that, for me, just watching that happen as a parallel track just shows how complicated it is to do this work. And what we've really seen in the pandemic is that we have heroes in our ECE field, and they do so much for so little. And I think we have to acknowledge that as a government entity. And how do we continue to fight for that voice, and use that as inspiration and motivation to really, really think about simplifying things and creating access, because it's, it is also a job creator, right? This field is just wonderful at that. And when we talk about the inequities that exist, it's not just for our kids and families, it's also, how do we create job opportunities for people in their communities that are livable, sustainable wages as well? And those are all things that, it might be a slow turn for us in the county to kind of make that happen, but just know that's what we're striving for. And I think sometimes getting the private investment and kind of working with our state partners to figure out strategies is really important. So Yeah. And then this was, thank you for the prompt. So what we decided is, and we have excellent, like I said, we have a lot of leaders. So the EC Policy Roundtable in LA County, led by Deborah Coleman and our other thought partners. There's commissioners, and it's a really great policy roundtable. Is really, and then we also have the Child Care and Planning Committee. So again, we have great leaders, as you can see on the bottom. We were I was at one of those meetings, and we were talking about ECE. And it was just, for me, it just was an opportunity. This is prior to the fiscal analysis. It was an opportunity of like, how do we partner with the state and elevate LA County? And if you guys are familiar with California, Northern California gets a lot of love, and Southern California, we have representation, obviously, but our governor's from NorCal, so I think it's his like comfort zone, my opinion, world according to me. So, you know, we were like, how do we elevate LA County and our voice to let people know and our representatives know that we are doing this work, that we do have great synergy, that we do have great collaboration, that we do want to get things done, we want to move the needle. And so what we ended up doing is kind of spearheading with First 5 LA, our Office of Child Protection, and all the folks listed at the bottom, the Crystal Stairs Advancement Project. We had a summit, and we invited state leadership. And, you know, the feedback that we got overall was people were just thankful to be in one room together, because sometimes it feels like an us versus them world that we live in. And so to actually have everyone come together in a common cause really was, I think, a great moment for us in this field, because it elevated the work that we're doing here locally. It kind of gave us an opportunity to feature the fiscal analysis, and to also let our state partners and state leadership know that LA County is on this, and that we are fighting for this. And, you know, we're about 42% of the population in California and LA County. So it really is, you know, what we really prioritize and what we really want to work on is really critical. And, you know, so much of what the Blue Ribbon Commission did, and that led to the master plan that the governor spearheaded, was really reflected there too. So I think to talk about synergy around this, and you know, as much as we're doing around in LA County about justice reform efforts and what that looks like, and diversion, again, it's so critical when we think about prevention and primary prevention and early intervention, how critical this part and this piece is for us to actually address the work that we need to do so we can serve our families better and provide that you know, pipeline of future success in an equitable way. And so I think it's really important, and it was a really great forum. I think we wanted to do another one, but the pandemic kind of derailed us, which doesn't mean we can't do it again. And so it's really, we want to continue building on it. So it's an organized way of just getting us informed, informing others, and really just continuing the work with the leaders that we have.
Remember during the early planning of the summit how important it was to be thoughtful about, you're doing something on a local community level, and there's lots of things that you have control over, but there's a lot that you don't when you're within a state, and that there needed to be really intentional thought about the connection between the two and the partnership of the two at the outset. And that was what the LA leaders were really trying to embody by holding a summit and inviting state leadership to speak, but also to see what LA was working on. And I think that state to local connection, you know, we often have state level conversations about how do you engage local, but the idea of local really trying to push and be the engager at the state level too, that it does truly need to happen both ways in order to make the changes, that everybody wants to be working on changes that are for the good of the services serving children and families, but sometimes being clear on what that path should be, that everybody needs to be really partnering on that path.
Absolutely. And I think one thing you realize about bureaucracies, I call it bureaucratic sludge, but you know, when you encounter someone who either from the direct practice of like, hey, I need access to childcare, how do I apply for it? And they're like, you're not eligible, and they're not helpful at all, to a bureaucratic person who understands policy but says that's not in my scope, I can't do this. You know, when you're met with people who are yes and, you know, I've learned this from my partners is, you know, in improv class, it's never no, it's always yes and. So, you know, it's that yes and mentality of like, how do we actually okay, I hear what you're saying, even though it's not in my scope or this is not how we do things, how do we actually make it happen? And I think that's what I love doing in my role as in this governance structure, is being able to agitate. And I say that in like the most gentle way. It's like a washing machine, like a gentle cycle on a washing machine. But, you know, I want to agitate as much as I can for consciousness raising moments. It's just that opportunity to be like, hey, have you thought about doing this way? Or what are some of the opportunities? Or can you tell me the historical context of why we're doing it like this? And 9 times out of 10, people will tell you, oh, it's really complicated on why. And I'm always like, please tell me why, you know, and you know, I like asking those types of questions because history is so important, and the context of, okay, was it someone who retired 10 years ago who made this policy decision that was wrong, you know, and can we redo it? And it's a different era right now. And so when you think about state and local, I never think to be, maybe because I work in LA County and I work for a board of supervisor, that I feel like, oh, okay, I can find someone in Sacramento. I can find a friend who works for one of the legislators to kind of propose this, you know, like when there's a will, there's a way. And between the network that we have in the ECE field right now, everyone's connected to everyone. The question is, are we aligned and asking for the right things? And I think sometimes as policy people, for me personally, maybe I think like wannabe organizer, but it's like, what can we attain right now? What's an attainable, winnable thing we can do with the resources that we have? And if we don't have the resources in government, because it comes with so many strings, where can we rely on our partners to kind of figure this out and say, hey, give us 2 years. Let's do this demonstration project. Let's create, you know, let's increase the workforce and create a pipeline to incentivize it, you know, and let's go. I'm using that as an example because it's fresh on my mind. And I think we're going to really need a lot of help with our workforce once we look at this recovery period, which was already an issue before. So, you know, but those are the types of things where we just want to be really, really creative and think outside the box. And that's how I like to function. I like to challenge everyone around me and, you know, maybe not get so challenged myself, but, you know, that's neither here or there. But I think it really is, I love hearing the problem, but I also want you to come with a solution, because I think that for me is, and then the thing we also probably lack as government entities is the implementation piece, because it goes back to that bureaucratic sludge of, my staff is not, they're civil service employees and they're not required to do this. It's not a job description in their bullet point. And you're like, okay, so how do I do this workaround? And in LA County, we have union representation in almost every facet. So it kind of, it makes it interesting. I don't want to say it complicates things, but there's an added element of how do we, if it's something as simple as like, oh, adding another part to this person's job description, but if they're union represented, we have to go through the union to talk it out. And so that adds to another element of this, where you have public pressure, the people on the inside trying to do it, and then you have the union, and it's like everyone just has to talk to each other and make sure we're aligned, and it takes leadership for that.
It takes being really active. So that's the other thing. Like, you're really giving us an example of active governance and really, really being thoughtful. And we really appreciate that, because I think what we really wanted to do with having Maral join us today was to share some of how someone in a policy governance position is thinking about their role in that active change maker, disruptor. I guess you were agitator, not disruptor. Agitator is a little kinder than being a disruptor, right? And that's that sort of need for active governance. It can't just be sort of, we do this because this is how we've always done it. And so we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon, Maral. And Maral is going to be around for the rest of the webinar. So if you have any questions, want to kind of pick her brain about some of the governance ideas that she shared, don't hesitate to send them into the chat. We're going to move to thinking a little bit about this play between the state and local, since we've heard such a great active example of governance in a local, but clearly we all well are aware that this community in particular is part of a very big state, in the case of the state of California. And Maral spoke a little bit about the interplay between the two, but we know that there is a lot to be done around understanding the state governance system that we have in place. And to Maral's point about sort of like, what's the historic context that got us to where we are? We know from the sort of non-system that we have in early care and education that in most instances, the governance that you inherited in doing your work, or that you kind of stepped into in doing your work, your current work in early care and education, is not a governance system that is built to respond to how we currently operate, or let alone if we're going to be making some significant changes in how we finance, how we administer funding to, and what we fund for young children, that the governance system is not likely designed to meet those challenges either. So this is a point for us to really be pausing and thinking about what our state level governance looks like as well, because we know a lot of local communities are like Los Angeles County, where they're really working on the kind of reflecting on their own, and with the interplay between the two is really critical, and we fully understand that. So we thought that pivoting now to thinking a little bit more about the reflection on state government would be a nice place for us to move to. So much like when we started out kind of thinking about this idea of readiness assessment, and we shared the readiness assessment tool for you all in the chat, one of the resources that's available through Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, we are pushing a little bit of thought around this idea of thinking about how the functions that state government is responsible for and how it prioritizes or performs those functions, and sort of what that looks like in your space and how that plays out within your space. So if you want to reflect, I'm sure many of you have done work on partnering with state governance. So if you want to share some of your reflections on maybe changes that you've been able to make, barriers that you've been able to approach and maybe find solutions around within your state governance, don't hesitate to share some of that in the chat with each other, because those strategies could be really helpful. But or even just do some kind of reflecting on this idea of the functions of the state and whether or not it's performing those functions in a way that's going to help you realize the principles and realize real change around financing and services. So pause for a second, let folks think a little bit on that, and before we then move to talking more about those governance models at the state level, and turn it over to Simon.
Okay, well, I will move on to the next slide, but feel free to keep putting things in the chat and we will review them and have people, if people want to share, you can use the raise hand function and we can take you off mute and you can share. So we did want to review the kind of 3 main levels of state governance, and you might have seen these talked about in a number of different places. There's a number of different reports out there that reference these, but we did just want to kind of give that overview of these 3 kind of ways that we sort of talk about how states have these different levels of governance. The first one is the coordinated model of governance, and this is pretty much the status quo in a lot of states. And this is where you have collaboration and coordination across different state agencies. And these kind of vary in their level of formality. Sometimes they have very formal agreements across agencies, or they have a particular governor's coordinating office or a children's cabinet that kind of is formally required and mandated to do this collaboration and coordination. Sometimes it's much more informal and is just based on kind of interagency agreements and is less sort of coordinated. You know, this system, you know, can be very beneficial because you don't have to develop new systems. You know, it kind of uses the current sort of structure of state government, you know, is not disruptive to the current programming, current staffing. But on the other hand, you know, it does rely on how well that coordination works, right? And, you know, it has to have a lot of trust between the different people in the different divisions, you know, and in general, like a lot of issues running into here is the lack of sort of clear authority over cross-cutting issues. So it's something, you know, as we know a lot in the P5 space, there's a lot of issues that are not sort of simple, right? The needs of a family cross a lot of different agencies. And so, you know, that can lead to some inefficiencies, some, you know, bureaucracy, you know, and data sharing issues as well are a big one in this. You know, one example here on the more formal end is Pennsylvania. This is kind of a hybrid because they do have this Office of Child Development and Early Learning, OCDEL. They've had that since about 2007, but it's not actually an independent agency despite its name. It's actually an agency that's jointly overseen by the Department of Human Services and the Department of Education in Pennsylvania. It's physically located within the Department of Education, but it's actually a coordinated model because those 2 departments coordinate together on this agency that sort of on this office that sits within the Department of Education. This second model is consolidated, and this is where instead of having this coordination, you actually just consolidate the early childhood programs, the early care and education programs into one state agency. So you kind of move everything so it's under one existing state agency, and this, really does think about bringing what are the different funding sources that are funding all those different services into that one agency. Again, this has often come about when we've seen pre-K initiatives or Head Start, the idea of making sure that if you're going to have some state pre-K or a new pre-K initiative in your Head Start, that you put those in your Department of Education, because of that kind of idea of seeing pre-K as more of part of the education space. And here you start to see some of the pros and cons of this, right? On the one hand, you're using an existing agency that exists and all the kind of inbuilt infrastructure and good things about having, that sort of agency with its structures and relationships set up. On the other hand, you can kind of dilute the focus on EC a little bit because it's maybe just one small part of the rest of the department, right? If you've got a massive K-12 agency, that's focused on, serving, all the big needs of K-12, sometimes early childhood can kind of be left behind on there, or that the mission kind of gets subsumed into the larger mission. So, pre-K is a great example where, if your early childhood division is in with the Department of Education, you're maybe more likely to be focused on, early childhood as a kindergarten readiness strategy rather than as a work support, right? Whereas if it's in health and human services, maybe it's the other way around. And, maybe that's the decision that your state makes, but the question is you should be intentional about what might happen if you go down the consolidated approach and whether it works to achieve your principles and your vision for your system up there. Maryland's a particular example if you want to look into this, and Casey's sharing a few resources in the chat that have a lot of different examples of some of these things in, but Maryland has a consolidated an early childhood division within their state Department of Education, which has their childcare funds and their state pre-K funds in there. And then the third one here is creating a new completely independent agency, and that's an agency that's dedicated entirely to early childhood education, however the state defines that. The benefit of this is that you're really giving some leadership to the vision and the mission for early childhood. You can really integrate and align all of the different programs. There's a lot of durability to it. Especially if the new department has been created through statute, it's a lot harder to change that if you have a new governor come in who isn't as dedicated to early childhood. If you have a governor's office for early childhood, that can kind of flex as to how powerful or not it is, depending on the governor. Whereas if you have an agency that's a dedicated agency, that has a lot more longevity. On the other hand, it does require a learning curve. Starting up a new agency takes time and money and resources, which are potentially being diverted away from the very real needs of children and families right now. And a lot of the complexity that exists in the current system does take time to unravel. So, potentially with this, you have a lot of short-term disruptions, but potentially for good long-term benefits. So again, just something to kind of bear in mind if you're thinking about that. In general, not a lot of states have done this. Georgia, Massachusetts, Washington are kind of some of the big ones. And most recently, New Mexico is an example of a state that just recently passed this and created a new agency. And just wanted to spend a couple of minutes kind of using the New Mexico example just to show you kind of how this governance structure has worked. So this chart here, which comes from a report that Early Edge California did, shows kind of what the New Mexico early childhood governance system looked like pre the new agency. So, they have had a children, youth and families department since the early 90s. Which you see here in the middle, but not all of the functions of the P5 system are underneath that, right? So you still have the services that we think about for P5 spread across 3 different departments: the Department of Public Education, the Children, Youth and Families, and the Department of Health, as well as TANF being in the Department of Human Services. And, this had led to programs operating independently, not being aligned in a meaningful way. And importantly for New Mexico, they were very concerned about the lack of alignment with data systems, having individual systems that were inefficient. And there'd been a long time effort in the state to really bring together these agencies into an independent early childhood education and care department. But there'd been a lot of pushback because there'd not been political will from the governor's office for a long time. But there was a big change when the state realized they had to return millions of dollars in unexpended funds and unexpended federal funds. They had to return them, which no state wants to be in a place where they're returning federal funds. And, the realization that this was happening because they didn't have a good overview of all of the different things happening across the system. They didn't have that clear, good management of resources, really led to, in recent years, this big renewed push for this. And so back in 2018, a new governor was elected with a big focus on early childhood education, and her lieutenant governor was a big proponent of this idea of having a new early care and education department. So one of the big pieces of early childhood legislation they passed in 2019 was the creation of the new early childhood education and care departments. And that began operating on July 1st, 2020. They have cabinet level leadership. Elizabeth Groginski is the first secretary of that. And I know Elizabeth was on the call, but I'm not sure if she's still there. If she is, please come off mute and tell us all about New Mexico. But the key thing with this was that they brought together all these different services that you see here over on the right-hand side. If you just go to the next slide. So really bringing together childcare licensing, pre-K, home visiting, the Head Start office, everything came together, including also a big push on an early childhood integrated data system with a unique identifier, so they could really track the outcomes for children and the impacts on children across this whole prenatal to early childhood to kindergarten, and really getting this seamless transition. Importantly, they also created in 2020 an early childhood trust fund, which is going to start distributing some money this year, and is going to actually provide that sort of long-term stable funding that we know that they need. We've all talked about that you need to support this system. So, there's a lot more you can read up on New Mexico and learn about New Mexico. They were obviously, in the kind of right in the creation phase right now, and dealing with COVID at the same time was obviously an interesting way to start the division. But it's just one example of how you can use sort of the data that you're getting to inform your decision making, right? I think throughout all of these conversations we've had today, if you think about, in LA County, they were able to use the data they got from the fiscal analysis to show the rationale behind the recommendations that they had, right? And to show this is something that people have acknowledge there's a problem in this system and there's complexity, but if you actually have data to point to show that complexity, that can be really helpful. Similarly in New Mexico, where they're able to say, we're actually leaving money on the table, we are leaving federal money on the table, again, becomes a really helpful talking point to say, this is why we need this new department. And here's the before picture with all the complexity, and here's the after picture. And if you've kind of got those fiscal mapping and analysis and showing the big need, you can really use all of this data to inform your decision making. So that's the bulk of our content for today. This is the last, as Gina said, of in our fourth webinar in this series. We're back in 2 weeks' time on March 17th for St. Patrick's Day. For those of you who celebrate St. Patrick's Day, you can't go out to the bars for St. Patrick's Day this year. So join us on a webinar on March 17th. And our aim for that webinar is really to bring all of this together. We've talked a lot about fiscal analyses, we've talked about governance and equity, and we've started to pull all that together today. But I think the plan on the next webinar is really to sort of say, okay, now you've got all this information, where can you take it and where can you go forward from it? But if you have particular things you want us to cover in that, please do let us know, because we want to make sure these webinars are really responsive to you. And we have 2 left this next one in 2 weeks time to bring it all together, and then a case study webinar. And so please do drop us a line and say, like, we really want to dig deeper into this. Our state or our community's really been thinking about this. I know there's some learning cohorts out there that have been digging into this work. And so we are excited to hear from you and for you to tell us what you need.
Especially for the case study one, because we really are going to craft the case study based on some of the top questions that we're hearing from you all along through this. So don't hesitate to point out specific case study areas that you might be interested in digging deeper on.
So with that, thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks again, Maral, for taking the time to be with us this afternoon, this morning. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you all in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.